Princeton University's Keller Center, educating leaders for a technology-driven society.
As a speaker in our Leadership in a Technological World series. This is a series sponsored by the Keller Center for Innovation and Engineering Education. And as many of you know, the Keller Center now is about 4 years old, but it's only recently been named and endowed by Dennis and Connie Keller. So Dennis is one of our most loyal Princeton alumni. He also is responsible for this building we're standing in. He's not an engineer himself, but he's a great friend of the School of Engineering, and the Keller Center is a great testament to his service to the school and his interest. As many of you know, the main goal of the center is to prepare students, both our own engineering students and non-engineering students, for leadership in a technological world. And there are many facets to this preparation, but one of the things that we do in particular is to expose students to leaders, and this leadership series is part of that. So leadership is one of those things that you really learn by emulating other leaders, and so this is why we're very happy to have Laura here today. I'll mention another thing that the center does in this regard, and that's to provide internships, and we have a particular internship program called Preparing to Lead. Lauren Hudson is here. She's been one of our sponsors of that over the years, and this is an opportunity for students, usually rising seniors, to spend the summer with a leader in the industry to see what that's like. And that's been very successful as well, and it's grown considerably over the last couple of years it's been in existence. So today I'm very happy to have Laura here. Laura is a great example of the kind of leader that students can look up to and emulate. She has several leading roles at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medical Center, including Chief Operating Officer, Chief Medical Officer, and Senior Vice President. As Chief Operating Officer, Laura is responsible for all the operations at both 781-bed medical and surgical hospital in Manhattan and the 276-bed psychiatric hospital in White Plains. 1,000 beds. Laura is a Princeton alumna, an engineer, of course, BSc in Civil Engineering and Operations Research, which is the predecessor of two departments now, Civil and Environmental Engineering and Operations Research and Financial Engineering. She has a medical degree from Columbia, and she's really taken her abilities to the very highest level of leadership in the front lines of the rapidly changing and very technological field of healthcare. In '93, Laura joined the full-time faculty at Columbia, specializing in pediatric orthopedic surgery. She served as Chief of Surgical and Anesthesia Services at Helen Hayes Hospital in upstate New York. And then from '98 to 2002, she was Vice Chair of the Department of Orthopedic Surgery at Columbia. Subsequently, she was Vice President for Medical Affairs at New York Presbyterian, which is part of the larger organization she's with now, until her appointment as Chief Medical Officer for New York Presbyterian in 2005. Laura has also been an activist in many organizations, including the Association of American Medical Colleges, the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, AAOS, and the Health Management Academy. She's also been, in particular in AAOS, she's been very active. She created a new quarterly publication, Orthopedic Medical Legal Advisor, for which she also served as editor-in-chief, and so forth. I can't give all of her accomplishments, or she wouldn't be able to get up here. In addition to all of these other activities, she's also a very valuable member of our own Leadership Council in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. So, like Dennis Keller, she's been a very good friend of the engineering school here at Princeton. Anyway, we're very happy to have Laura here today. She's going to talk about a sharp knife and a steady hand, perspectives on leadership from a surgeon. And we're very interested.
Thank you. Thank you, Vince. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I was saying a little bit earlier when I had a few minutes to chat with Vince. When he first asked me to do this, of course I said yes, and would be delighted. But honestly, I didn't really know what I was saying yes to. And then when I got a chance to take a look at the previous speakers in the Keller Center, I was pretty amazed to be asked, and I said, I've got to bring something different to this table, because you've been very privileged here at the Keller Center to have so many wonderful speakers. That's when I thought that I would share with you a little bit of how I think about leadership. I've been in a number of different leadership roles, and I'm going to try to use some analogies to surgery that I think will make sense to you, even if the only surgery you've ever seen has been on ER or one of the other medical shows. And actually, by the way, many of those shows bear no resemblance whatsoever, and others are quite accurate. And it's one of the things that people ask me about, and I'm happy to discuss that with you at any time, but please don't use those as a way to get your medical knowledge. So let me just frame, that was a lovely introduction that Vince just gave. My mother would be very proud, but let me frame a little bit of how I come to be standing in front of you today. I'm a Jersey girl. I grew up in actually the town I live in now, where I live with my family. And I came to Princeton after a public school, specifically to major in engineering here. And I did that actually knowing that I wanted to go into medicine. And I tell you that for those of you who are students, that I came because of the engineering background and the engineering degree. I knew I was fortunate to have a father who had an engineering degree, although not from Princeton, and who never practiced engineering per se, but that it was a way of thinking about one's career and one's decision making, and I have never regretted that. I will tell you that my Princeton education is something that I value tremendously, and it's no secret to people who've known me for any period of time, in part because I do talk about Princeton in a way that I think prepared me for all of the things that came for me afterwards, and honestly prepared me to be a leader. I was, as Vince said, in what was then civil engineering and had a focus within systems. So I was in something called, this ridiculous title at the time, called basic engineering, which was terrible because it just had the sound of you were basically going to be an engineer, maybe, sort of, and it really wasn't that at all. It was in part because it was a way about thinking, and most of the people who had that concentration did not actually end up as engineers. Many went into the financial world. I'm hearing from them a lot these days, but a number of us went into medicine or to other fields. My roommate went into publishing and into that industry. And again, this particular background was a way of thinking and using some of those skill sets to think about other activities. I wrote actually a thesis, and again, knowing that I wanted to go into medicine, I wrote about decision analysis and how people make decisions in medicine. And in fact, that was a great opportunity. I'm delighted that I had that chance to kind of blend those interests. I wrote about people who are making decisions about high-risk pregnancies. And in fact, I myself ended up with a high-risk pregnancy a number of years later, not while I was at Princeton, but had a chance to think about, being in that real world. And again, I was pleased to have had that opportunity to connect those dots. After I left Princeton, I went to medical school. I went right to Columbia. And for those of you who know something about medicine, and again, maybe you all have gleaned this even if all you know is from TV, that there are two very big distinctions in medicine, and there really are some differences in the surgical fields and in the medical fields. But medical school, many years ago and now still share some of the attributes, which are that you go and you take a little snippet of lots of different parts of medicine. And for me, although I liked all different fields, I really resonated with the surgical disciplines. And there are other people who will tell you that they went through medical school and surgery held no appeal. There are just obviously some fundamental differences. Now, the training is different, but as you can imagine, what you actually do is very different. So medicine is still organized into fields, and what you learn after medical school to be a pediatrician is different than what you learn to be a surgeon. And in fact, different types of surgery are also have very different training programs. My field is orthopedic surgery. I knew nothing about it before I got to medical school, but fell in love with it while I was there for a couple of reasons. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that because I'm going to connect some dots a little bit later. Orthopedics is the study of the field of bones and joints, and it is a field that crosses both really the entire age spectrum. So there are babies who are born, and actually some babies we know even while the mother is pregnant have orthopedic problems, perhaps with spine or hips or feet. All the way through to the elderly, where osteoporosis, I'm sure you've heard of, and fractures are actually a significant problem in the elderly, but everything in between. And it applies, frankly, as a discipline to everyone, and it's whether you're a professional athlete or you're just someone who enjoys walking around, you still can end up with an orthopedic problem or concern. And so it's a fabulous field in terms of what you see, but it's also really fun. And what I mean by that is it is very similar to carpentry on people. And you get to use a lot of the same equipment. Now, I will confess that Princeton didn't prepare me at all for that. I got to medical school, and my first, you take a whole bunch of different things in medical school, as I said before, and then you spend some time doing these different things. And I got to my first to really watching, wasn't doing anything much in my first orthopedic surgery case. But occasionally, they'll let the student do something, and the surgeon was putting in a screw, and it's literally just like you think of with a carpenter and a screwdriver, and they look like things that you get at the hardware store. Sometimes they are, although sterilized. And the attending surgeon, the person in charge, said to me, "Well, you can put this screw in." And I'm embarrassed to say that I said, "I'm not sure which way to turn the screwdriver." And so I got some interesting looks after that one. I had not learned the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, which apparently I've now made sure that my children know, but it's just fun. And another thing that's fun about it is that people get better, which is not to say that all of medicine isn't appealing. It is in many ways, but there is something tangible about orthopedics where you can see what you're doing, you see the x-ray, you can see the bones and screws and plates in line, and it's appealing. I married a surgeon right after I finished medical school, and I was doing my training because you spend, depending on the medical discipline, you spend a number of years doing your training, and that should make sense to you since you would not be too excited about a new student operating on you or your loved ones. But I married a surgeon as well, and I thought that I was going to go into clinical practice, that I would finish my orthopedic training, and that I would take a job somewhere, and that I would, live in the suburbs and practice in a local hospital. And then a couple of things kind of intervened that I want to tell you about, because you'll see how they connect. My husband and I had discussed having this notion of two careers. And I knew that I wanted to have a family, but I also knew that I wanted to work. And we made some real decisions about how we were going to follow our careers. In medicine, and the way you end up training is you sign up for something and you enter a lottery system. And wherever you match on that lottery system, that's where you end up going. And so we knew that we'd have some challenges, and then as we were going to go through some of that with where we'd end up. We both ended up in New York. We had children. I had twins when I was a senior resident, and then I finished first because my husband is a chest surgeon and was doing something even longer in terms of training. And I got really good advice as I was taking my first job. So my first job that I was done with all of my training, and my chairman at the time said to me, "You should go back to school." And I'll be honest, I was very offended by that, because someone telling me I just finished all of this time going to school and doing training, and frankly, I really needed the job. And he said, "You should go back to school because you will gain some valuable skill sets that will stand you in good stead if you want to be a leader in this field." And that was an interesting notion. What he was really saying to me after I sort of discussed this with him was, he said, "You want to be someone who, as you're going to be who knows where, and as you are going to be with a spouse and children, you want to be someone who has a skill set that can do things other than just orthopedic surgery." And I thought that was an interesting way to put that. I ended up staying in orthopedics for a number of years, but I'll tell you how this related to leadership. I went back and got a management degree, and the notion in that type of training in a management role did teach me a lot about leading, and it was a lot about teamwork, because there were really formal lessons to be learned about what it means to lead a team. And that, although today it's a number of years, as you can tell, since I was in medical school, today we're clearly adopting more of those techniques and thoughts and skill sets, and that's right. So I give you that sort of career path just to say that I do believe that leadership is an incredibly important, it's a privilege. There are skills that go with it, and one never knows when you'll be called upon to do that or have some of those opportunities. Now, I think it's also fair to say that Vince was talking about I've had a lot of different roles as I've left clinical medicine. So I no longer operate, and I miss that sometimes because I told you how fun that is. What I miss the most is having that interaction with patients and families. And I get some of those rewards in a different way by running a hospital now, and I interact a lot with patients. But I will acknowledge that a lot of my career advancement has been that I was in the right place at the right time. But I think that I often stepped forward as a leader, even when I was sometimes leading a group of 2 or maybe 3. My first leadership role that Vince was talking about sounds like a very important title, but I was a chief of surgery in a very small hospital, so I was sort of chief of myself and the anesthesiologist who would come and do my cases, and some of the students, and then we'd have a number of other part-time people. But having to actually make decisions and to lead a team, even small, taught me some valuable lessons. Now I'm in a different role, and I have responsibility for a lot of people, and it's not only patients. I'm privileged to be in healthcare where we're really focused on patients and health and This is going to be a very exciting time, I think, the Obama administration time, as we look at healthcare reform. But I'm also responsible for a lot of staff. So I have about 10,000 staff who work under my units, and that too has taught me a lot about challenges around leadership. Obviously, it's different leading a small team than it is having thousands of people and focusing on, the size and scope of budgets when you're talking about a hospital enterprise is very different than when I had a small department. But some of the principles are exactly the same. And I think that's really my message to you today, that a few of these principles, and now I'll talk about, they are the same whether you're leading 2 people or you're leading 2,000, or maybe you're leading an entire country, and sort of reflecting upon that in this time in which we have a new president. I think you'll follow where I'm going with this. So, to me, the most important thing when I talk about leadership, when I think about leadership, when I reflect on what that means, is that I think it really does mean something to be a leader, and that you need to act like the leader. There's a time for teamwork, and I'll reference that in a minute, but actually being the leader is not the same as just managing folks. It's not the same as just making some assignments. It has true meaning, and it's got to be inspiring in some way. If there's not someone following you, you're not actually leading anything or anybody. And in order to get people to follow you, you've got to think about what's your message. It's got to be setting the tone. As the leader, if you have an opinion, you've got to say that, unless that's the style that you're soliciting everyone else's opinion first. But at the end of the day, you've got to stand up. Now, think about a surgeon. So think about an operating room. A surgeon, there is always one person in charge. There could be 50 people in a room, and maybe you've heard about, recently in the news, for example, there were conjoined twins who were separated. Conjoined twins are two children who are born at birth and they're connected. Formerly, we had often referred to it as Siamese twins. That's a big deal to separate those children, and you can have hundreds of people in those ORs doing that, and they're often into teams, but I assure you that there is one leader. There was one person in charge. Now, that person is responsible for everybody who's in the room. So now think about a surgery that's maybe not as complicated as something like that. It's maybe I was fixing someone's elbow injury. There's still one person in charge. There's a surgeon, there are anesthesiologists. Someone's got to do that work to put the person either asleep or make sure that there's no pain felt. I reference students are often there. There are what we call residents. Those are the people who are training. There are nurses throughout. There are techs. There are people who are bringing in supplies. But at the end of the day, one person in charge. And that's, I think, always got to be in mind as a leader. Without one person in charge, you can count on the team in some disarray. You can count on things being miscommunicated. And if you're not in control, if the surgeon's not in control, I don't know why anyone would agree to be under his or her care. So I mentioned already that I always feel privileged to be in healthcare, and that's, someone's putting ultimate faith in a surgeon. Well, the same thing is true in a leader. If you want people to follow you, you've got to be in charge. You've got to be accountable. We sometimes call that being captain of the ship. And as I said, when you've got to make a decision, you're the one there. And by the way, what comes along with that is sometimes a heavy burden. So there may be lots of other people who are there, and they may make mistakes. You're still in charge, and in some ways the leader gets credit when things go well. A really good leader makes sure that the team gets credit, But I can tell you right now that to be an effective leader, when things go badly, it's your issue. And it's the really fine leaders identify ways to have seen some things coming, but when some of the inevitable happens, it's a true leader who stands up and says, I was responsible for that. So now to go back to my surgical analogy, when I have had students or a nurse do something wrong, it was my responsibility to stand up and fix that, and in fact make that right. But you're not alone in an OR, as I just said. So a true leader also recognizes that it's about teamwork. And as much as you need to stand up and be accountable, you are so much more effective when you're thinking about your team. So go back to my OR analogy. I couldn't do what the nurses were doing in that setting. I wasn't trained to do it, and frankly, it wouldn't be a good use of my time. So I'm dependent on setting the tone, setting the stage, making sure that I'm delegating in the right way. If I'm not doing that, frankly, I'm wasting time. And to think about this from a surgeon's perspective, time in surgery matters to a patient. The longer someone is in the middle of a surgical procedure, the more complications can arise. And so time is of the essence. And now to go back to that, that's a leader's job to say, I need you to do this, I need you to do this, this is your role, and this is my role. And to make sure that that's done. Delegation is hard in whatever field you're in. Leaders are often type A people who want to get everything done themselves, and struggling with the notion of being more effective and letting others do it is an important job for a leader. This idea of the right person for the right job is critical, and also trusting your team. So leaders know that the team needs to do their work and cannot be micromanaged to be effective, hard as that is. And so trust is important, and I referenced earlier, you want people to follow you. That's the notion of being a leader, and that's inspiring to a team when the team knows that you as the leader trust them. But because you're accountable, there have to be some checks and balances. So this notion of trust but verify is an important one for a surgeon. You've got people's lives at stake, and I think that goes to leaders of all kinds. Now let me go back to what I was telling you before about orthopedic surgery. I'm going to use orthopedics because I think it will make sense to you, but it's true for any surgical procedure. Nobody walks into an OR, no surgeon worth his or her salt walks into an OR and says, no, I'll just wing it. I'll just figure it out when I get there. That's not how you do it. That's not how you do it even in an emergency setting. You plan. And some planning has to be part of what a leader does. That's your job. Now you obviously can do it with others, but to walk into an operating room without having spent some time thinking through, this is what I'm going to do. So go back to my description of orthopedics. I would be fixing a kid's hip. So a child would have something, perhaps something that he or she was born with or had developed over time. I didn't just walk in there and then decide on the spot. I spent some time thinking about what the challenges were. I thought about what equipment I was going to use. I thought about the people I needed. And that's what made that effective. And it's true really for any kind of medical procedure. It would be foolish for a surgeon not to think that through. We say in orthopedics, you know, just like in carpentry, you measure twice because you want to cut once, right? You've heard that if anybody's done any kind of carpentry. You learned that in what used to be called shop when I was a kid. But it's true, and think about that perspective on a patient. Well, same is true from a leader's role. That if you're approaching that leadership role, again, I'm thinking about some of the challenges I'm facing now in moving an organization through a very difficult period of time financially, as healthcare is being hit with some fiscal challenges, perhaps not to the same degree as other industries, but having to make some decisions about how we can staff and how we can meet the needs of our patients. Not to have a plan for my team isn't going to work. And I go back to some of those principles that before acting, planning has got to be part of it. But I'll tell you another important piece of information, a skill set that I learned because of surgery is that you'll never have as much information as you want. And so as a surgeon, you've got to get comfortable with being willing to act even when you have some imperfect information. And that absolutely, I think, is true for leaders of all kinds. So think about a surgical procedure. You reach a point in which the patient's in front of you on the table, and now you've done great planning, but something's different. Maybe it was that the drill I was using broke. Okay? Maybe it was I get in, I'm actually looking at the person's anatomy, and it's different than what I had thought. Or it's not, the typical. There is no typical in human beings. At some point, and I had one time a surgeon say this to me because I was training and I was standing there hesitating for a while. And basically he said to me, Laura, you just can't stand there. She'll bleed out if you don't do something. And he was being maybe a little melodramatic for me at the time, but you can imagine a situation in which that is true. You've got to act. And you've got to say, I don't actually have everything I could want right now, and I've got to be, somewhat flexible, but I got to deal with what I have right now. And that's true in every leadership role. And so this notion of analysis paralysis can sometimes take hold. It can be, let's think about this a little more, let's analyze it, let me get one more bit of information, let me see one more number, and then I'll decide how I'm going to take on this challenge. You can keep going on that. And sometimes it's better just to say, I've got as much information as I think will be helpful. More may not make any difference, and I'm going to go. Now, you got to go into it with, I'm going to be able to, I will do it, and I will deal with the consequences, right? You can't just do something just to do something. That's crazy. And that's also would be a ridiculous approach in surgery. But sometimes you've got to just act. And this old adage, I'm using a few of them today, of perfect is the enemy of good, is absolutely true in surgery. So think about what I was saying before. I already told you that I like that idea that on an X-ray I can see where all the screws go, and that's a badge of honor. But that isn't always what's right for the patient, right? So making the X-ray look perfect and everything right there takes more time. I may have had to cut through more tissue to do that. Sometimes you end up saying, I made the right decision and I'm going with it. Or I encountered something I wasn't expecting and I'm going with it. And leaders have to get comfortable with that all the time. And part of the role of the leader sometimes is to get the team to snap out of it. So sometimes in a team what you see is that you'll be driving to consensus and someone will express an opinion and then you'll go around in a circle and you can just keep going. Because everybody can be adding a bit more information, and at some point that's enough. And often the leader is the one who has to say, we've all had our chance to do that, and here's where we're going to drive to some decision. Now, I referenced before also this notion of a lot of people on a team in an OR, and the idea that there's always one person who's truly in charge. But communication is so critical. So you can be in charge all you want, but if the only person you're communicating with is yourself, nothing will get done. Absolutely nothing. So imagine an operating room where I'm now surrounded by people, and I've made some decisions about I'm going to use this piece of equipment and I need that drill, but I haven't told anyone that. Well, think about that for a minute. You recognize it would be again, a ridiculous position to put oneself or a patient into by not communicating that plan. Nobody's a mind reader, and I think that for me, in this uncertain time as a leader, the ability to communicate, again, whether I'm talking to someone in an OR or I'm communicating what our goals for this year in 2009 will be, is critical. And perhaps more so in uncertain times, people are looking to the leader to stand up and say, this is not just what I'm thinking, these are what our goals are, this is how we're going to be measured, this is what we're going to do, and these are the things we don't know. So part of being a leader is this notion of being inspiring. But you can't be disingenuous. So when I stand in front of my teams these days, and I do that a lot at all levels of staff, I'll tell you that more frontline staff come to meetings now than ever before because they want to know what's going on. They want to understand from my vantage point as the leader, what do I think are the challenges? And I think it's important to be open and honest, and yet always with this idea of optimism. So no surgeon goes into an operating room without some sense of, I'm going to make this better. Because if you don't think you can make it better, you're not going there. So always with this idea of hope and optimism, but realism. Now, when I was thinking about what might actually draw someone to come and hear this talk today, I always like to throw in something about a knife. A sharp knife always gets people's attention, but I actually put it there for a reason. And what I meant by that was something that we talk about in medicine all the time, and perhaps even a little bit more so in surgery. But this notion of when something is toxic, something is not right for the patient, the strategy really is to cut it out. Now, we of course have lots of fancy tools now, and sometimes we're lasering things or we're doing things with special equipment, but the notion is the same, that something that's not right should be out. And my point about using a sharp knife is that there are a lot of ways to handle these types of things, and the concept of a scalpel and being able to very precisely take out what is not needed and is harmful is an important one. So, you can also take something out with a machete, but that's not what we tend to use in an operating room. This idea of precision. And here, what I mean by that in terms of leadership is that sometimes there are things that you as the leader have to do, and you have to remove something. It might be someone who is not right for the organization. It might be a very difficult decision, but your role as the leader is to think about removing whatever that is that's not allowing things to go forward. Leadership is tough. It's about making tough decisions, and if that's not part of your psyche as a leader, I think you're missing the boat. That there will be difficult decisions, and it's not obviously about getting people to like you. I would submit that fine leaders care about other human beings and are not oblivious to those issues, but just like in a patient, it's about the health of the patient. When you're leading a team, it's about the larger institution, the larger goal that you have, and not about individuals. And sometimes, for the greater good, you've got to take something out, and that's okay, even when it's tough, even when it's very difficult. You're familiar, of course, with the Hippocratic Oath, which all physicians, surgeons sign on to, which is first do no harm. But I think it's bigger than that. I think as physicians, surgeons, the notion really is do the right thing. So there are always lots of things one can do in medicine. There are lots of options for a surgeon. But I believe you never regret doing the right thing, making the decision. And again, I've said, sometimes you make decisions that turn out to be wrong, but don't start with doing something that's the wrong thing. Now, what do I mean specifically about that? Well, it shouldn't be about ego. It should be about the patient or about your team, about your goal. It shouldn't be about trying to cover up something. The notion that you can make things worse by saying something that's untrue is magnified in healthcare, And when you're going down the wrong path, the best thing to do is stop and turn around and write that problem, that issue, in surgery, do the right thing. And I think it goes to not just things that you're doing, but actions that you're taking. As a leader, your actions are more meaningful than any words you will ever say. And so this notion of doing the right thing is critical. I do think that a sophisticated leader is also comfortable with admitting a mistake. In surgery, you've got to admit when there was, if something now has got to go in a different direction, that's one thing. But there are times when you just plain make a mistake. I assure you that any surgeon you will ever meet in your entire lives, if they stand in front of you and say they never made a mistake, then they've never really been a surgeon. It's not conceivable. It's not possible. It doesn't fly. And that's how you know when someone's really a fine surgeon, when they can talk about the mistakes that they've made and then how they made changes and what they did differently and that they were willing to share that. That's what a leader does, is that when you've made a mistake, you learn from that you try not to make that mistake again. Obviously, it has consequences not just for patients, but for other implications in one's life. You got to be realistic. You got to be honest with yourself. Denial doesn't help. Patients can die, but I'll submit to you that teams can die. A different type of death, perhaps, when the leader is not open and honest. And sometimes it's really the little things that matter. I had an experience a while back that I'll just share with you. I was in front of a very large group of my management staff. I had about 200 people in the room. And we were talking about safety, and which is obviously a critical issue for us. We've made it one of the hallmarks of what we think about at my hospital, New York Presbyterian. And it's a regular meeting in which I've got about 200 people, and I'm leading it. There's a lot of other people talking, or a lot of other people who would be standing in front, educating and sharing information. But I'm leading the meeting, and I was sitting off to the side, and we asked for it to be very interactive, a lot of back and forth and questions, and I didn't understand that, and how does that apply to my area? And I've said many times, that's what we want you to do. Because as an organization, we're committed to safety, and if you don't ask the question, then how will we know we're getting it right? And so somebody asked a question, and I was sitting in a chair over there, and someone else was fielding the question, and I heard the question, and I took offense at the question. She referred to something, and the details are not important, but the way she said it, I jumped up, walked over to the microphone, which I often do. I'm often very interactive in these sessions, but I said, "Mary, you know the answer to that question." And in fact, I believe that Mary did know the answer to that question. And the meeting went on, and of course, imagine, what that had a chilling effect on questions. And I went back and I sat down, and about 30 seconds later, I came to my senses, and I realized that I had done exactly the wrong thing, right? Here I was saying, we want you to ask questions, we want to be open and honest, we want to have that dialogue, and I had absolutely stamped that down. So I had a little more forethought, and I waited for there to be a little break in the action, and I came back to the podium, and I said, "Mary, I want to formally apologize to you. I made a mistake. I misread what you were asking. The question was, there's no bad question, and I want to talk about that." It took just a couple minutes. I got, I'm going to say, maybe 50 emails or phone calls or people coming up to me over the course of the next couple of days. And the story pretty much went like this. I was really glad you did that. I thought you were a little harsh on Mary, and I'm really glad that you said you made a mistake and apologized in that open setting. And I think I had that very brief window in which to have fixed that. It sounds like a little thing, but I believe that the difference I made in my team that day over that, frankly, I should never have done that to begin with. I know that, but I did it. And it was one of those reflex actions, which, I probably need to work on. But once I had realized I'd made a mistake, I don't know that had I let that opportunity pass to apologize, I could have ever quite gotten back there. Now, I'm sure I still have some consequences from that, but I'm human, and I'm going to make mistakes. But I think in the end, I made a good decision for me and for my team. I do think that humility goes a long way, and surgeons are not always known for their humility. Some of them do believe they walk on water. Although, funny story about that. I'm in New York City, and I happened to be in a room with a surgeon who was talking to someone that I knew, and the daughter, he's a heart surgeon, and the daughter was so appreciative of the work she had done, that the surgeon had done, that she turned to her father and she said, "Here he is. This is the surgeon. He just walks on water." And the surgeon looked over, and we're actually on the East River, and he looked over and he goes, "Actually, the only people who walk on water around here are pilots." And it was such a fabulous way to sort of deflect that. I'm just going to close by kind of wrapping this together. I think I've said a few times that as a leader, I believe that people are watching you. Sometimes that's actually a little unnerving. That I'll be somewhere and someone will reference something that I did or said, and I'll think, oh my gosh, I hadn't even thought that I was on display. But the truth is, you're in charge, and so as I said, actions speak louder than words. It's okay to have high standards. You should have high standards. That's part, again, of being a leader. But you got to communicate those standards, and you got to hold yourself to those same standards. When things go well, it's really not about you as the leader. It's really, as I said, all about your team, and that's your goal, is to make your team understand that. When things go badly, I guarantee that the first time you stand up for your team member when it was in fact something that person did, whether intentional or unintentional, as is often the case, I guarantee you that that's someone who will in fact be happy to be part of your team. And to me, at the end of the day, leadership is about inspiring people and encouraging others to stand up and be accountable and recognize everything that goes with that. So with that, I thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Yes?
What do you do when you feel overwhelmed, when there's too much that you can't handle? Do you compromise? Do you sacrifice? Or do you get help?
Yes. Depending on the situation, you might have to do any of those strategies. I don't think, though, that I would frame it in quite that way. So this notion of being overwhelmed, I'll just say, as a leader, to be personally overwhelmed is, I'm sure, again, everybody is human. I have yet to hear about maybe an honest leader who didn't say, of course I'm overwhelmed at times. If you're not overwhelmed at times, it may be because you're not being challenged enough. But again, I think that's going back to what are the really important issues. So, for me personally, that's very important sometimes to just stop and do a little regroup so that I'm not now communicating to everyone, again, some of that fuzzy message. And so there are times when things have to come off of the to-do list, including for the team. Not everything can have the highest priority. Everything is important. We talk about that a lot. But, something's got to go first. And trying to narrow that down. So rather than sacrificing or compromising, I think it's a lot around prioritizing. And then being able to say, this would be nice to do, but I can't do it right now. So I'll give you just a quick example. I was counting on some new equipment this year to replace some old equipment in the hospital, and you know, we planned this quite a bit ahead of time. Well, you know, like everyone else, we've been caught up short by some capital crunch issues, and I'm not able to do that. It's not a compromise, it's just the reality of what we can do. That's helping to reorder some of the priorities. We'll be creative about some other things, we'll make some other things last, we'll postpone, you know, some advance that we would have liked to have done, but, you know, at the end of the day, the most important thing is that I keep the beds open and the lights turned on, and I will get to that next innovation when we can. Yes.
You mentioned that you know, having sort of taking responsibility when things go wrong will allow team members to be really appreciative. But I was wondering how do you do this in such a fashion that doesn't send the wrong message to your team members?
Well, there's the conversations I have in private with the team member, and then there's what I have in public with, you know, so when someone has, first of all, I don't think anything is served by when someone makes a mistake not having that conversation about the mistake. And even when things go wrong, and nothing was intentional and nothing malicious, but things can go wrong, I think that's my obligation to say to someone, you know, this might have been handled differently, or to have a conversation about how might we have done that differently. And of course, it matters on what it is. You know, if I go back to a surgical case, I better be sure to be helping someone understand when a mistake was made and, you know, someone cut the wrong thing. But there are other times when perhaps a style didn't work or a result wasn't gained. I think it's my job to have those conversations. Feedback is hard, but I don't think people are well served. Then there's the, you know, what is it in public or in front of others? And that's a very different situation. That I think it's important as the leader that's a, you know, there are times in which you just need to stand up and say, this was ultimately my responsibility, and that's the burden of leadership, and that's okay.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you so much.